You're listening to This Motorcycle Life, conversations about why we ride. Episode 27, The Joyous Struggle. I'm Bruce Philp, and thank you for listening. Well, it's the sort of question you could build a media empire with. Why do we seek adventure? In a moment, you're going to meet someone who embarked on one of the biggest motorcycle adventures there is, and his reasons might surprise you. Not because they're radical, but because they're as old as storytelling itself. His story is a reminder that the best adventures take us from our past to our future, and I can't wait for you to meet him. But first, let's take care of a bit of podcast business. As always, I want to say thanks to the people who've written me over the last month. I know I say this every episode, but it's true. These notes and reviews really keep me motivated. And one of those notes explains the theme music at the beginning of this episode. You may have noticed that it was, better. Okay, a lot better. And that's because it was arranged and performed by a professional, a young Toronto guitarist named Harry Bartlett. Harry is a listener, and with both his performing and teaching careers on pause at the moment, he's become interested in what music can bring to podcasting, starting with this improvisation on my original theme, which landed in my inbox just last week. I hope you like it as much as I do. I'll include some information on Harry in my show notes, but for now, all I can say is thank you for lending your talent and skill to this project. It's made me want to raise my game, just when you think people can't surprise you anymore. I also want to remind you to sign up for my newsletter if you don't already have enough motorcycle stuff to read. You'll find a link in the show notes for this episode. And if you enjoy this podcast, please consider making a donation to the Movember Foundation. You'll find a link in my show notes for that too, and I would really appreciate any support you can manage. Finally, I want to take a moment to acknowledge what's going on around us. Depending on when you listen to this episode, much of the world may still be on lockdown in its fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, most importantly, I hope this finds you and the people you care about well and safe. And if this has hurt you directly in some way, you're in my thoughts. But I also realize why you're listening to this. There are far better sources of information and commentary on this subject than anything I can offer. So I'm going to stick to my knitting here, if that's okay, which means doing my best to find some hopeful distraction on two wheels. And that turns out to be exactly what this episode is about. So let's get to it. Back in the winter, after deciding to promote them on this podcast, I paid a visit to the Movember Foundation to introduce myself and learn a bit more about what they do. Well, this indoctrination included stories about the people who've taken up Movember's cause and the things those people have themselves overcome. They were all, as you can imagine, humbling and inspiring, which I'm sure is the point of telling them. But one story in particular just wouldn't let go of me, and not because I could identify with it personally, or at least I don't think so, because staring back at me from the screen was a decidedly gentle-looking, bespectacled young Englishman named Henry Crew. In that image, Henry is 22 years old, and he has just finished becoming the youngest person ever to circumnavigate the globe solo on a motorcycle. It was a remarkable achievement for a good cause, and all the more so because Henry himself has battled anxiety and depression for much of his own life. Well, these things alone would make his story very much worth telling. But what I think fascinated me was this. Often, people who take on this kind of challenge are racing against some kind of clock, fulfilling a lifelong dream, or checking off a bucket list fantasy, or making up for lost time. And yet here is someone whose entire life is ahead of them, who hasn't accumulated too many regrets and mistakes yet, who could have put this off for years, decades even, and maybe even until the dream was so perfect that reality could never live up to it. Instead, he went. I had to know why, and I guess if I'm honest, I wanted to know what it would be like to have had that courage when life was just beginning. I reached Henry Crew at his home in London, UK. Hi, Henry. Thank you for joining me. How are you doing?
I'm good, Bruce. Thanks for having me on your podcast. It's good to finally talk to you after a few weeks exchanging emails.
Yeah, these things are never as easy to organize as they seem. But I was thrilled to be introduced to you by the folks at Movember, at least to be introduced to your story. And so I'm glad we finally made it work. And I do appreciate you speaking with me. These are kind of strange times, but I feel like the motorcycle community's, getting at least a bit of comfort and inspiration from each other. So, and I think that's a lot of what your story is about. So I'm really excited to help you tell it.
Yeah, cool. I'm excited to chat to you. And yeah, it's definitely strange times at the moment, but another opportunity for the motorcycle community to kind of show how we do pull together.
Yeah, and what we're made of. So look, why don't we? This might be the hardest question I ask you because it's the broadest, but I couldn't think of a better way to do it than this. Why don't you just introduce yourself? Tell us who Henry Crew is and where and how he makes his way in the world.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Henry Crew. A year ago now, almost, I got back from a 52,500 mile trip around the world to become the youngest person to circumnavigate the world on a motorcycle. I did that over 381 days and raised about £12,000 for Movember, having had issues with mental health myself throughout my teens. I worked with them through the whole project, went through 35 countries, and that was kind of a year and a bit of my life. Since coming home, I've worked with various kind of companies and motorcycle brands, mainly promoting products and traveling, creating digital content for them, really. So that's my full-time gig now.
Oh, cool. I still am going to ask you about that because it's interesting how this story kept going after you came back. So we'll get to that in a minute, but let's why don't we dwell a bit on the trip, because that's obviously in some ways the most fascinating part of the story. From reading about you, and you've had a fair bit of media coverage, there seem to be sort of two narratives that lead up to your decision to attempt this ride. There's a narrative about Henry who always wanted to ride a motorcycle, and then there's a narrative about Henry who spent a long time fighting for his own mental health. And these things always seem, kind of tidy in hindsight. But I'm curious to know, for you, how did those two storylines meet? What led up to you saying riding a motorbike around the world is the answer?
Yeah, they are very intertwined. I had wanted to ride a motorcycle ever since I was a little kid, really. No one in my family rides motorcycles, so I didn't have an opportunity to get into it from a young age. And I started riding motorcycles at 19, as soon as I could kind of take a decent sized license, decent sized engine capacity license in the UK. So at 19, I started riding motorcycles, having already had issues with my mental health since I was about 14. And it was something that I wanted to do, and something that once I started learning how to ride a motorcycle, I realized I really enjoyed it, but I had no idea how much of a benefit it would have on my mental health. And it became something that I really relied on and gave me a form of escapism, which I couldn't find anywhere else. So kind of by accident, it started giving me more than just enjoyment and pleasure from actually riding a motorcycle. And I had ridden for maybe 2-3 years by the time I decided to do the around the world trip. And again, that kind of came about by accident. I was riding motorcycles every day, wanting to plan bigger trips, longer trips, but I just couldn't take the time off work. I did a lot of freelance work as well. So if I did take time off, I wouldn't get paid for it. And I was sat at work one day, frustrated with the jobs that I was getting and how that side of my life was going. Frustrated that I couldn't take time off, couldn't travel on a motorcycle. And I turned on my computer and an article came up about Kane Avellano, whose record I broke, saying just basically an article about his record and his trip. And I was reading through it and just decided then and there, I was like, this is the only way that I'm going to be able to actually get any time away on a bike. And it just so happened that meant doing one of the longest trips you can kind of come up with. So it all was intertwined and it all kind of fell into place. And from my experience with mental health and how motorcycling had helped me, and also riding in the Distinguished Gentleman's Ride every year since passing my test, Movember were the obvious choice for me. A charity that I had already supported and truly believe in. And I also knew that they would be interested and take an interest in me and show me the support that I needed to raise more money and awareness for them as well.
Mm. Now, you said in an interview that I read, I guess, or perhaps it was in the short film that was on the Movember website, that you initially did this for selfish reasons. And I'm wondering how you would describe your motivation in the end and, what changed it? What was the moment when it wasn't selfish anymore?
I think it's a difficult one. It wasn't that I had selfish intentions when I left for the trip, but I think my point of view on it was that doing a round the world trip is an inherently selfish thing. You leave behind your family, your friends. It's something that you do first and foremost because you want to do it. And deciding that you want to do it has consequences that I would consider selfish in many ways. It's not the kind of thing that everyone can do because there is so much you have to walk away from. So I don't know if my actual motivation for doing it changed. I wanted to do it because I wanted to ride motorcycles. I ended up being put in so many situations that changed my character, and I guess you would call them character building situations, being forced to engage with complete strangers, to talk to people about mental health that I'd never spoken about my own mental health before this trip, on top of all the kind of strains and lessons that you get along the way while traveling, especially on your own. So I think I'm really glad that there was another, not motivation, but I guess kind of cause attached to it, which gave me just a completely another dimension to my trip that, again, made it more engaging and more beneficial for me, but hopefully way more beneficial to people watching the trip and people that were kind of engaged by it along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, I like, that's a very honest answer. My sense of a lot of people who have become, altruists on their motorcycles is that they sort of backed into it. They first discovered that riding was good for them, good for their spirits and good for their emotional health. And then they thought, well, maybe there's a way I can, share this or at least legitimize it and make it feel a bit less, egocentric. And then they sort of fall into, charity rides or advocacy work of one kind or another. And so there are a whole bunch of people in this space who do real good, but actually backed into it because of an honest desire to share something that they, initially discover for themselves. I don't know whether maybe I'm rambling a bit, but I wonder if that resonates for you, if you feel some fraternity with people like that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different people that ride motorcycles, and I'm sure that a lot of them have their different reasons for doing it. I personally feel like a lot of the times charities are just picked up along the way because they lend an excuse to certain things, whereas I knew from the start that doing the trip would give me a good platform to be able to speak about something else that I cared about. I wasn't trying to shoehorn it in. For me, it just made perfect sense that motorcycling had really helped with my mental health, and I know it helps a lot of other people. Movember already had the motorcycle connection through the Distinguished Gentleman's Ride, and it was something that I actually wanted to put my hand up and talk about, although I'm not sure at the start I really understood what that meant. And having to talk about my own experiences with mental health and kind of put my hand up in that way was uncomfortable to start with.
No doubt. No doubt. I wonder, so, I mean, I don't want to sort of pull the conversation into a place that, is too personal. So I'll ask this question broadly, and you can go wherever you feel like going with it. But I'm curious to know how you would describe what riding did for you, what it was that you could do when you were 19 and licensed, that was needed or missing when you were, 15 and suffering.
I think for me, it almost felt like pulling the cork out of a bottle that was just so filled up with pressure. I had struggles with depression and anxiety, and I just always felt this kind of bottled up kind of anger, anxiety. It was just a mess of kind of suppressed emotions and feeling. And for me, motorcycling just allowed me to take a breath, just slow things down, think things through one thing at a time, or think about nothing at all, and just purely focus on riding itself. It also got me out of the house, which is super important when you're dealing with issues like depression and anxiety. It gave me a reason to get outside and see new things and breathe fresh air and meet new people.
Yeah, which I also want to ask you about that, because that is a theme that keeps coming up when I speak to long distance riders. So I guess we'll get to that. But I want to get back sort of to this question of motivation, and not what motivated you, but maybe more like what drove you. So I hugely admire what you did here before you even left. I mean, if I read correctly, you spent 10 months planning this. You prior to that went through the process of becoming licensed in the UK, which I gather takes a huge amount of commitment compared to a lot of the rest of the world. And then you went and did it, 381 days, 55,000 miles. I think before you even left, I read that you'd actually managed to wreck a motorcycle, in the course of preparing for this. Given that it hadn't yet gelled into a cause, so to speak, what on earth kept you going? Where did you get that drive from, and how did you not give up?
Yeah, so it was a long process. I think I decided to do the trip in around May. By August, I'd written off the motorcycle that I'd planned to do the trip on, just commuting back and forth from work every day. And I just had an unlucky day coming back in the rain and washed out and completely totaled this motorcycle, but luckily wasn't too badly damaged myself. And then you start the process of how am I going to fund this trip? How do I even get a visa? I'd never got a visa before in my life. So all of these things were new and interesting. And to be honest, it was a really welcome break from the sort of mundane day-to-day that I was stuck in with work. And every step felt like a step closer to leaving. So there was a real sense of progression, which is giving you motivation itself. I think as well, I could see that this was my one way out. I'd kind of looked at other options and nothing was really happening. So for me, this just became everything, and I just became completely obsessed with it. And having contacted Movember and announced it quite early on, I couldn't really back out.
Right. Yes. Yes, I'm familiar with that phenomenon. You commit before your heart's in it, and then your heart's in it.
Yeah.
Did you have mentors along the way? Was there help, or was this a solo process for you?
I think I found a lot of inspiration through books and films and TV shows, and I just became obsessed with learning as much as I could about other people's trips. I was fortunate enough to speak with Charlie Borman through a friend, and did a little interview for Movember with him, and grilled him about his trip. But I think, I mean, a lot of the information is just gleaned from forums and other people's trips, and you get into kind of rabbit hole of, well, if I have to get this visa, then I also need this, and this, and what could go wrong on the road. But everyone leaves on the first day a complete novice, and it's not until 6 months into the trip that you have any sort of idea of what you're doing. And even now, coming back, going on shorter trips again after this big trip, for the first week, I feel like an absolute novice, and it is just about time spent in the saddle, and every new problem is a little bit more skill in your arsenal, really.
Is there something appealing about that feeling like a novice? It almost sounds like a kind of, I don't know, rebirth. You're reminding me a bit of Jeff Hill. I don't know if you heard that episode or not, but he talks quite a bit about that feeling of starting over, that, clean sheet of paper. Obviously, you felt it in a big way when you did the round the world trip, but I'm interested that it stuck with you.
Yeah, I'd never ridden outside of the UK before I left for the trip. I'd ridden every day in the UK for maybe 3 years, back and forth to work. But this was something that I'd never done before, and I knew that it was going to be the end of one chapter and the start of something else. I didn't know what the something else was going to be, but I knew that it was, whether it went well or if it went really bad, at least I wasn't going to be back in the same place when it was all said and done.
Right.
I was going to be somewhere different, or I don't know, but it still feels like that day to day, doing new jobs, working with new people, working on new trips, or going on seeing new places. And that's something that's really important to me, and I really value, is I wouldn't call it novelty, but it sort of is. There's so much to see. Even coming home to my hometown where I grew up, I was seeing it completely differently, having had that detachment from it for so long. It's a really hard one to explain, but it's exhilarating having nothing in front of you, but everything in front of you.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. It's funny. My next question was going to be, describe that moment of departure. I mean, aside from feeling like a novice, I was wondering, kind of what was going through your head and through your heart when you put the kickstand up. I think you've kind of answered it, but do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. So I left the bike shed in London, which is like a big motorcycle venue in Shoreditch. Really cool spot, and a bunch of people met me to ride out from there to the Channel Tunnel, where I left for France. And it was just a bit of a whirlwind, really. With the Movember involvement, there was a few kind of press people there, and I felt like I was just getting pulled from pillar to post and then plopped on a bike and patted on the back, and it was off you go. Kind of launched out of the gates of the bike shed, and my sat nav just kept pinging, like it would go to the end of the road and then redirect somewhere else. And this was like the first 10 minutes of my trip. I was like, how am I going to make it around the whole world if I can't even make it out of central London? And eventually my friend Paul was like, he's born and bred, well, not born and bred, but he lived in London a long time and knows that area of East London like the back of his hand. He was like, look, follow me for this bit and then you'll be on your own for the rest of it. So we all followed Paul out of East London, got to the ferry, or the train, the underground train, got to France, and it started lashing it down. It was completely chucking it down, and I was camping the first night, and I had a tent that was like a coffin. I couldn't even sit up in it, let alone stand up. Everything was soaking wet, and probably at like 4:30 in the afternoon when I stopped on the first day, lying down in a coffin in the middle of nowhere in France, just thinking, why am I doing this? And I don't know. It was such a confusing feeling because you're like, if this is going to be every single day of this trip, it's going to suck. And it's not too late to turn back at this point.
Right.
But then at the same time, I don't know, I'd been building up to this point for so long, for 10 months, getting ready for the trip, preparing everything, saving the money and getting the visas, and had so many people doubting my ability to even get to that point. Wow. That I was just on cloud nine, just ready and so hyped just to have the opportunity to start. And getting to that start line was, I knew if I got to the start line that the rest of it I could do. It was the kind of paperwork and the financials that were the difficult part for me.
You said people doubted you. Is that so? Did you get a lot of skepticism about this in the preparation?
Yeah. I think people normally fell into two camps. They would be, I mean, you talk to anyone and you're like, oh, so I'm going to ride a motorcycle around the world. I'm going to be the youngest person ever to do it. And they even go, yeah, cool. And they don't really take you seriously. And especially when you're like, oh, I'm going to leave in 10 months. Most people aren't really thinking 10 months in advance. And 10 months always seems 10 months away, even when it's only a couple of weeks by the end of it. Or people are like, oh, that's never going to happen. How do you think you're going to do that? Blah, blah, blah. You haven't thought about this. You haven't thought about that. I'm quite slapdash in my approach to a lot of things. And I think I probably was with the trip as well. It's like, I can do it. I knew I could do it. I knew that I could do it with the skills that I had pretty much. And I don't know, just kind of, I had a feeling that it could be done. But I think a lot of people were just looking at the bits that they thought I couldn't do, which is not what I was focusing on at all. And the interesting thing as well for me was that people that didn't even ride motorcycles thought they knew what I couldn't do when it came to this trip, when I myself didn't even know what the trip was going to contain, and no one can know.
Yeah, of course. There's nothing like a little bit of rage just to kind of keep the fire lit. That's interesting. Having said that, I mean, I think a lot of people might look at a story like this and imagine it, as cinema, in which there's an emotional, heroic, and uplifting climax, and everybody gets a bit misty, as you cross the finish line. But I noticed with interest on Ducati's website. Now, you wrote a Ducati, which we'll get to again later, but they used the phrase to describe your journey as a joy story. And, even recognizing that that's they're trying to make that into a brand equity, I still thought it was an interesting choice of words. Was it a joy story? And was it about joy? Tell me a bit about that.
It was really hard. A lot of the time, and for long periods of time, it was really difficult. But I was just so grateful to be doing it the whole time. I think with Scrambler Ducati, their brand for that is Land of Joy. So with that particular phrase, I'm sure they were just trying to tie it into their brand. But it wasn't. I don't know. It was if I was going to rewrite it, I'd probably call it, I don't know, the joyous struggle, because it was, a lot of the time it was gritty and strenuous, never easy, but I was so happy to be doing it.
I might use that as the episode title, if that's okay. I think that's a great phrase. So when I saw that, and we touched on this a minute ago, I wondered how much the joy part had to do with something that every long-distance rider I've ever met has talked about, which is the power of this kind of riding to restore your faith in humanity. Now, you haven't said that
Yeah.
disappointment with your fellow man was a theme, in your life, or that it wasn't. But notwithstanding, I wonder, was that your experience, and was that in fact a source of joy?
Yeah. It was a whole nother world for me. Having been involved, I worked in the music industry before I left for the trip, and it's an industry that feeds off other people. It's very parasitic and it's very dog eat dog, and that combined with the general atmosphere and attitude of people living in London, I hadn't seen the kindness, the openness that I experienced on this trip probably ever. I think it's a Western culture thing as well, that we're not as open and not as kind and generous to complete strangers as other places in the world. And I think maybe it's a rare thing as well to come across someone so vulnerable as a motorcyclist on their own in the middle of nowhere that needs help. And maybe we would all act differently in that situation. But I think it was twofold. It was a revelation in the generosity, the kindness, openness of people, and how far they'll go to help you out, but also a revelation of myself and what things I value in other people and in life, and also what I can expect from myself.
And was that experience healing? Is that the right word? Did it have that effect on you?
I was restorative, definitely. I was. I think it was refreshing, and it really did rejuvenate my belief in humanity.
Now, you've mentioned some tribulations. Now, there's no way to do justice to a ride like that in a conversation like this, I know. But I'm assuming that there were those trials and tribulations, and in fact, there may have been dangerous moments or situations you weren't sure you can get out of. That you could get out of, so I guess I'm wondering, first of all, is that so? And secondly, in your memory of the ride, what do those moments now mean to you? What do overcoming those moments now mean to you?
I think firstly that it's difficult to capture it in a podcast, but it's also very difficult to remember it, how it was and how it felt when it happened, sitting here now, because those things, they kind of become the myth and become the story, and I myself romanticize them and look back at them with rose-tinted rose-tinted glasses. But at the time, it was petrifying at certain points. I wasn't sure whether I was going to kind of live through a lot of points, or it's very hard to explain to someone that's almost had a civilian lifestyle, I would describe it,
right,
when it's someone that doesn't understand what it's like to not be sure if you're going to be alive at the end of this section of the trip.
Right.
It's very difficult even to comprehend yourself, so how can you possibly explain it to someone else? But yeah, they've become the kind of peaks and troughs and the stories which people enjoy hearing the most, and I enjoy telling the most. But at the time, some of them were pretty petrifying, and it didn't really take long for them to start kind of popping up within my journey.
Right.
I think the first one was as I got to the border of Russia. All the travel advisories changed to don't travel to Russia. The UK government were like, no citizen should enter the country, because there'd been a few poisonings in the UK, and I was crossing Russia the next day, and I had to cross into Russia because my visa was going to expire if I didn't, having started the trip slightly later than I planned to. And I got to the border, kind of got through customs, and then was going through the passport control, and everyone else had this form, which I didn't have. And I was trying to ask the guard for the form, and he just kept walking away from me. I was like, we're going to be here all day. But eventually he comes back with two other guards, and they start shouting in Russian, and I'm like, I have no idea what's happening. All I want is this bit of paper. And then these three massive Russian dudes were like, follow us. So I'm following them around the back of the passport control to this shed down the bottom of an alley, and go in. They shut the door behind me. It's full of all of these security guards, and they've all got billy clubs and guns, and they're all like, I don't know, the look that they gave me put fear inside me, and I thought, this is maybe day 25 of my trip, and I'm about to never be found again. And then as soon as the door shut behind me, beads of sweat are dripping down my forehead, and everyone else burst into laughter, and they thought it was really funny to kind of frog march me out, put the fear of God into me, and then they're all laughing and joking and helping me fill out my my customs declarations and stuff. But to me, on my own in this Russian border crossing, that was the first time I thought, okay, well, it was a fun 20 days.
Oh my God. Yeah, well, I guess the Russian sense of humor perhaps is impenetrable to us, but I'm not sure I wouldn't have fainted dead away. Wow.
Yeah. And I think things kind of just continue like that. I don't think I had any near-death experience that was the same as the last, to be honest. But they always kind of pop up, whether it's bad roads or car crashes around me. When I was in Chile, I was riding down the side of this mountain, and there was quite a lot of traffic, and the truck behind me, the car behind me, just its tire exploded, and it just started spinning and stopped about a foot from the back of my bike.
Jeez.
I had coaches that came round corners and toppled over, roads crumbling, bridges collapsing, had all sorts of madness. I hit a man actually in Iran.
Oh no!
There was a guy that walked out of a crossroads in front of me. It was a green light, and I was at the kind of coming over the crossroads, and the car in front of me swerved out the way, and there's a guy walking across the road on his phone, and ended up hitting him maybe 5 miles an hour maximum. But you don't want to be doing that sort of thing in the center of Tehran.
No.
It causes quite a bit of fuss.
Jeez. I guess so. I mean, I wonder, I'm just trying to put myself in your position because I've never done anything like that. And I think for me, the first couple of times I might have said, I wonder if there's a way to get out of this and make it stop. But then there's a point where I think you just say, I'm in it now. And that's kind of somehow calming. I think that's how I might react. Was that what it was like for you? I mean, when you dealt with those Russian border guards, were you kind of resigned, or were you wishing for a helicopter extraction?
Honestly, when I started my trip, not expecting but accepting that it puts your life in danger was just part of it, and I knew that was a possibility, and I was completely okay with it. I think for me at that point, it was more about making a drastic change to my lifestyle was more important than actually making it through the whole trip. As long as I started, that was what was really important to me. So it didn't really faze me too much in that way. It wasn't something that I thought about in advance or cared about in advance. And I don't know, I like to know what's happening and have some degree of control in things. The trip was a really good exercise in relinquishing all of that and just going with the flow completely, because there's so many things that you just cannot control, and trying to control them will just make it worse and make your experience worse as well. There was a few things where I was trying to really, really make sure I arrived to places on certain dates and kind of stick to a more strict schedule, and it just put so much stress on me, and it didn't make me arrive there any quicker. And after that point, I just realized, you know what, whatever happens, happens. There's going to be delays. There's going to be flat tires, and there's going to be border crossings with guards that want to bribe and won't let me cross, or the ferry's late, or whatever it is. It's going to happen, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. And you really just have to learn at what point you sit back and at what point you do try and push a little bit.
Mm. And have you taken that philosophical, equipment home with you? Do you find yourself dealing with situations differently now as a result of that? Does it linger?
Yeah, I think so. There's a lot of skills that I kind of transfer, and there's a lot of ways that both my life and my character and my personality has changed. But at the same time, there were so many things that the trip gave me that that I no longer have regularly inputted in my life. So it is a balance. There's a certain amount of things that are very beneficial and very good traits to have, but they're only accessible or relevant in that situation.
Right. That's interesting because, you meet people who go on trips of a lifetime, that involve airplanes and buses, and they come back and say, well, that was life-changing. But when I talk to people who've done the kind of thing you've done, they need regular booster shots, if you like. Is that your feeling? Are you going to have a bit of this in your life forever now?
Yeah, I think... I don't know, if I hadn't seen such beauty and riches, maybe I could live with being bored, but it's not really possible. It's kind of like lifting the veil a little bit.
Right. I'm wondering if you can describe, so I'm wondering what the feeling was that you were chasing, or if you could even put words to it. You can look back in hindsight and you can characterize the journey as you have done, but I wonder if you left, seeking something in particular, if that had a name.
I don't know if it had a name, and I'm not sure I really knew what it was, and I don't know if I know what it is now. But it was just pure escapism for me. And to be honest, I was running away as fast as I could from the trajectory that I saw myself on at home and in the current work that I was in. So that was really important to me. But my attitude and my overall, I don't know, the way that I would describe myself and the trip changed a lot at certain points. At the start of the trip, I didn't need to eat. I didn't need to sleep. All I wanted to do, and I could do it at the start. I could just ride forever and it would not be tiring. And I was so absorbed in how amazing it was that I could just go, and my body didn't want for anything. And then you get to the point where things start to get a little bit rougher, and you get more tired, and you have to deal with that, and the reality of it kind of sinks in a little bit. But then at that point, you think, oh, this is the adventure that I was actually looking for.
Right.
When you're sleeping in a prison in Pakistan, you're like, this is terrible. But at the same time, I did sign up for this, so I probably deserve it. And then it's fine. And then I had just completely maxed myself out after that kind of phase. I think leaving India and Southeast Asia, I was just completely burnt out, having not eaten enough, not been sleeping enough, just being too many miles in, and just putting too much strain on myself. I lost a third of my body weight, and at that point I was just really drained, and I needed a break, and I knew that I needed a break. So that kind of came at the right point with Australia, which was a nice kind of cut back to a little bit of normality. I mean, I could speak the language and order my own food and read road signs and ask people for help and all of that kind of stuff. There was regular petrol, regular food, and it was kind of smooth sailing. Although it was also an incredible place, it was just a bit more relaxed, and I didn't have to be quite so on edge or push myself quite so hard. So that was a really kind of vital point for me, and I relaxed a lot. And I kind of, I don't know, it wasn't so much of a challenge, which was actually welcome at that point. Mm-hmm. Whereas the other times maybe I'd been searching for a little bit of danger. And then I actually met my current girlfriend when I was in Australia. So that kind of threw a spanner in the works, with everything there, completely unintentional. I met her in Melbourne, continued my ride. I stayed in Melbourne maybe a week and then continued my ride up to Brisbane, left my bike there with the shipping company, and then flew back to Melbourne for a month, and just stayed with her and didn't look at a bike, didn't touch my phone, anything like that. I think that was another big stress for me, was the social media side of things. And as it grew and as my trip progressed, it became so consuming. Every day I'd spend an hour and a half in the morning just replying to messages, and then I'd have to think about, if I'd had any photos, and if I didn't post anything, people would think I was dead. It was really stressful. So that was complete switch off and reset for me at that point, which was invaluable. But it made it all the more difficult going to South America and starting again. It was literally like the start of the trip again. I felt like a complete novice because I'd relaxed too much and just got too comfortable.
Yeah, but I can sure see why you'd need the break. I mean, just so I can situate it in my mind, what roughly was the route?
So I left the UK. I went through France, northern Italy, Slovenia, basically into Eastern Europe, and then across Ukraine into Russia. I was only in Russia for about 4 days. There's sort of like a small gap between Ukraine and Kazakhstan. So I bolted through there, dropped down to the south of Kazakhstan. And my original plan was to go down through Uzbekistan, down through Turkmenistan and into Iran. But Turkmenistan wouldn't give me a visa. So I got to the south of Kazakhstan and had to turn around and do a 3,500 mile detour back on the exact same road I'd just ridden. To the Caspian Sea, and I got a ferry across the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan and dropped down into Iran that way. Went kind of on a big diagonal down through Iran to the southern tip of Pakistan, and then up all the way through Pakistan to Lahore in the northeast, and into India that way. Went through the Himalayas for a few weeks, down and across the whole of India, up through the Chicken Neck into Darjeeling, and then into eastern India, down through Myanmar, Thailand, Southeast Asia, all the way to Malaysia, and then flew from Malaysia to Western Australia to Perth. And then I rode across the whole south coast of Australia up to Brisbane and flew out to Santiago in Chile, and then rode up the west coast of South America to Colombia, every country in every country in Central America, then up through Mexico into the US. And I did sort of originally intend to do a big C shape up into Canada, but by this point I'd lost so much time with various inconveniences that I ended up having to do sort of like a big U shape. I came into Texas, went over to Florida, and back down out to California, all the way up to Seattle, back down to California, and then back across and up to New York. So it was a really stupid route, but there was just things I wanted to see and people I wanted to meet. And
of course,
I knew how much time I had and how much money I had. So I was like, I think by the time I got to India, maybe even before then, I was just like, nothing else actually matters apart from making the most of this experience. And that was about it.
Yeah. Well, Canada won't hold it against you, but you'll have to come back. You saw some beautiful country in the U.S., though. I don't think you wasted a mile. So let's talk about the bike for a second. Just because, as we mentioned earlier, it's hard to kind of do justice to something like this in a podcast because you can be sure that there are some people out there who are listening who are imagining that maybe they might try it. So, I've got to make sure that they get taken care of too. And so hence my question about the bike. Now, I know Scrambler Ducati was a significant partner for you, and that they equipped you with a desert sled. I'm curious to know how that partnership began, and then tell me about the bike.
Yeah, so it all started, as we kind of touched upon before, with me writing off the bike that I'd intended to ride around the world, which was just my daily commuter, a Kawasaki W800, which I sort of described to everyone as a poor man's Bonneville. So that was my daily ride, and I completely wrote it off. So then the question kind of came, what bike am I going to ride for the trip? I didn't even have a bike at this stage. And that happened a week before I met up with Movember. And Ben, who I met at Movember, said, "Don't worry, we can sort your motorcycle. I've got a friend that works for Harley Davidson." I was like, okay, around the world trip on a Harley Davidson. I guess we can do that. My intention from the start was that it wasn't that I wanted to ride an inappropriate bike, but I didn't want to ride a traditional or predictable bike, I guess.
Right.
So I was kind of okay with the Harley Davidson thing. And to be honest, as we've mentioned multiple times, I literally had no idea what I was getting myself in for. And I don't think anyone does. Even someone that's done it before, I don't think they could understand what it's going to be like the second time. But I was completely naive in many ways. Unfortunately, the Harley Davidson thing kind of fell through in the late stages, and we talked to a few other manufacturers, or Movember talked to a few other manufacturers, Royal Enfield and even Norton, ironically. I don't think they wanted me to succeed. There's something in there that's giving me weird vibes. But really late in the game, I kind of remembered the Ducati Desert Sled and just decided that was it. That was the bike that I was going to do it on. And Ben got in touch with the press team for Ducati, and they said, "Yep, we'll lend you a bike for the trip." So that was kind of that. And it happened literally 2 months before I left. And that was either side of Christmas. So there was probably a month to get it all organized and signed off. But the sponsorship was basically a loan of the bike for the trip from Ducati UK. So I wasn't actually sponsored by Ducati Italy. I didn't get paid anything to do the trip. I didn't have any financial support or part support or any sort of planning support other than, here's a bike, go and do the trip and give it back to us when you're finished.
Right.
All of the support from dealerships was completely off their own back, and the Ducati community was completely off their own back. Just trying to help out and make the project succeed, if that kind of makes sense.
Right. Yeah, of course. That's interesting. So, because I was curious about your choice of bikes, and now maybe I'm extra curious because you actually picked this. So that's a 73 horsepower motorcycle that was built, really primarily for fun. I've owned a bike that had the same engine in it, and it is fun. It's also hot, at least it was in the application that I wrote. But I guess what's important here is that this is not a Ewan and Charlie-sized battleship, or at least not on the face of it. So just like a typical kind of biker question, I got to know, how did it do?
Yeah, I enjoyed every single mile I was sat on it. Which I think is as much as you can ask from a bike.
Right.
And for me, it was very important not to have a massive battleship. I didn't want the weight. I didn't need the weight. I didn't need the extra power. I wasn't really that bothered about the comfort at the start. Maybe a bit further down the line, I started to question that aspect. The only thing really that I think you have to worry about is fuel capacity and reliability. Maybe Ducati don't have the best reputation for reliability, but from the way I was looking at it, it was a tried and tested air-cooled engine that I could probably do a bit of work on if needed. It had enough power to kind of put in a lot of highway miles, but it was light enough that I could throw it around off-road, pick it up on my own if I needed to. it just ticked a lot of boxes, and it looks brilliant as well. So that was just icing on the cake. But yeah, I think the important thing for me, and I'm sure most adventure riders or people that have traveled with a motorcycle would say the same thing, is it always amazes me. You go to the most remote places and the most gnarly roads, and a local guy is going to be riding it on a 125 or 50cc Chinese bike.
Right.
And if you rock up on your battleship, you just look silly because you're struggling to get this massive tank across this tiny bit of road while all these locals are just kind of bobbing along past you, probably 3 or 4 up on this tiny little motorcycle as well.
Right. It's so true. And you hardly touch that bike from a modification point of view, right? It's essentially mechanically stock.
Yeah, mechanically stock. The only things I added, I could probably count on one hand. I mean, it was spark busters, a little fly screen, comfort seat, homemade pannier racks, and some different foot pegs, and a loop for some heated clothing. I think that was tail rack. I think that was about it.
Wow. Ducati owes you, I think. Well, that's impressive. So just staying on bikes for a minute, because who doesn't like talking about bikes? I saw from your Instagram feed, it looks to me like your daily rider is a Triumph Street Triple, which is a bike I love. And I guess I'm wondering whether you love it too. It looks like you do. It looks like you ride it for real. And, so I'm wondering, like, compared to the Desert Sled, the Street Triple's a kind of a rowdy motorcycle. And that makes me want to ask, how would you describe yourself as a rider? Because the picture that I get in my mind from the beginning of this story is that you're, a pretty serious, committed, young man who picked the right tool for the job. And then I look at your Instagram feed and I see this guy having a ball on a Street Fighter style bike. And I'm compelled to ask, who are you?
It's a difficult question, and I think for me, I'm a motorcyclist, and I love all motorcycles. I got into motorcycling riding a chopped up 1982 or 84 Yamaha XS400, and I was completely into the custom and retro motorcycle scene. Mm. And then from there, I got more into classic bikes, and then I was spending a lot of time riding them and thought, actually it'd be really wicked if I could travel and see some new places while riding a motorcycle. So then my taste kind of morphed again, and then I ended up with the Desert Sled, and then from there I got more into all different kinds of bikes, really into alternative adventure bikes and lightweight adventure bikes. I'm not a big fan of like the massive GSs, and even the Triumph Tiger for me, it's a little bit overkill for what I would want to use it for. But then at the same time, I before the trip, I'd only ever really ridden on road. So coming back to the UK, there's not a huge amount of off-road riding that you can do on a bike that could also ride on the highway. So I kind of made a sacrifice and I wanted a bike that was really fun on road, was reliable, and I could ride every day and commute on, but also maybe play around with a little bit in terms of looks and some kind of subtle modifications. Mm-hmm. But I think actually the main thing in picking up the Street Triple was budget. Having spent everything I had on the round the world trip, to come back, I had a very strict budget on. I need a bike that's reliable and ticks all those boxes, and also comes in way under this budget, right, if possible.
Right.
I mean, I'd never had a fast bike or kind of modern sporty bike. I think I'd only ever ridden twins, really. That triple engine is incredible, so smooth and so calm. But then pick it up past 5,000 RPM and it will take your arms off and put a big smile on your face. So it's an incredible bike. But my plan, well, it was until a couple of weeks ago, was to be moving out to Australia next month. more permanently, and the sights are well and truly set on a Suzuki DRZ 400 and making a little bit of an adventure bike out of that. So I really kind of bob between everything, and there isn't a bike which I wouldn't like to own, truth be told.
Well, you've got good taste. People adore those DRZs, like, to the level of cultishness. So I think you'll probably enjoy it. And I assume that you're moving to Australia for love. So congratulations there. But another happy ending.
Thanks.
So back to the trip for a second. I'm curious about. I sense a fair bit of marketing savvy in you, which is either a natural talent or maybe it's professionally acquired. But this comes to mind because I know you had a couple of other sponsors. I think, or at least companies that helped you out a bit. Mallet comes to mind. They provided the luggage for your bike, I think. You departed from the bike shed, I noticed, which is a pretty sort of a hip place and, in a pretty hip neighborhood. And I guess sort of cutting to the chase, a lot of these brands are kind of prestigious or at least fashionable, and sometimes both. And I think this is really smart if the goal was virality. But, here I am answering, your question for you, which is bad interviewing practice. So I'd love to hear your perspective. How intentional was all this, and how did you make it happen?
It was 100% intentional, but it wasn't always my intention. Because I was working with Movember on the trip, it was really important for them to have as much exposure as possible.
Right.
So, it was a bit of a balance. I wanted to work with cool companies. I didn't have money to buy luggage or buy an adventure suit and stuff like that. So it's kind of a blend of all three. I needed the exposure to be able to get the things that I needed to complete the trip with no budget. Movember needed the exposure to raise more money and awareness for themselves, and also just to be able to tell the story and do it in the way that I wanted to. These were brands that I already admired and wanted to be involved with. So there's a lot of different aspects to that. But yeah, it was definitely intentional. The whole kind of Instagram and YouTube motorcyclist thing still really kind of amazes me. Just the stats and numbers that people kind of pick up, and the kind of cultishness of it as well. I never did it in order to raise an Instagram following or anything like that, but there was a lot of press opportunities and certain decisions were made to get media coverage basically for Movember.
Yeah, which clearly you did. But what's interesting to me, apart from the savviness of using aspirational brands to do it, I guess kind of gets to my next question, which has to do with your age. So, I mean, you make a point of your age in the telling of this story, and rightly so, and it defines the record you set. And so I have to ask, how did being young play into your decision to do this? And how did being young, play into how you went about it?
For me, it was the kind of hook, if that makes sense. I mean, I worked in marketing before leaving for the trip. So when I read that very first article about Kane and that moment that I decided to do the trip, it kind of clicked in my head that that's how you hook people. That's the unique selling point that allows you to do this trip, that allows you to take the time or leave work completely and dedicate a year of your life to sitting on a motorcycle. So yeah, it played a big part. And I think it was, I don't know, I think you'd have to maybe ask the people that watched it how much of a factor of interest it was to people. I think it's quite hard for me to be objective on that front. It wasn't like I felt like I wanted to prove a big point by doing it at a certain age. And it was beneficial in many ways because I didn't have a mortgage or a family or any of those commitments that might have kept me from doing this trip. But I did feel a big sense of achievement, more, I think, in the planning and getting to the start point than maybe completing the trip itself when it comes to age. I feel like the planning and just getting to that start point at the age that I did with the resources that I had was almost more of an achievement in many ways.
Mm. Yeah, that sounds right. And maybe what's behind the question is a bit of a geographical bias, because in North America I'll call it there's a piece of received wisdom. I'm not sure I believe it, but there's a piece of received wisdom that says that, that millennials don't ride motorcycles. And so it's hard for me from a North American perspective to look at what you've done and not wonder if there's a millennial point of view on this. And if that word makes you cringe, I understand it. It has the same effect on me, but this is the world we live in. So I wondered whether, you feel connected to that generation, on any of the issues, on writing, on setting audacious goals, on mental health. Is there anything about this story that you felt was generational in nature, or that you felt was thrust upon you on those terms? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, again, it works on a few different levels. With mental health, suicide's the biggest killer of men under 45 within most of the Western world. So I'm right in that age gap, or age bracket. And I think I was sort of at an age where I could speak to younger people and I could speak to people my age, but I could also speak to people older than me. And I think with motorcyclists, by and large, a lot of us are just big kids. And I don't think that age plays a huge part. Mm-hmm. When you're actually in front of people, most people will have a conversation with you. And when you're doing something that forces people to take you seriously, that was kind of beneficial in that way as well, that when I was in front of people, I think people maybe gave me a little bit of respect in advance. Whereas now I feel like as a millennial or whatever I am, I'm quite often kind of looked down on or brushed over by the industry and also motorcyclists if they don't know me, if that makes sense.
It does.
But even with my trip, it's a prime example of how the industry neglects younger riders. I had no financial backing from any company. There were hundreds of companies that just weren't interested in the trip at all. A lot of media outlets that weren't really interested and would rather report on traditional activity, and lots of companies that would rather invest millions of pounds in traditional activity, which just doesn't speak to people my age. So I think the kind of blanket statement, millennials don't ride motorcycles or aren't riding motorcycles or aren't getting into motorcycles, may be true, but saying millennials aren't interested in motorcycles, I don't think is correct. I don't think millennials are addressed by the motorcycle industry in the correct way by people that know how to talk to them and people their own age. I mean, when I see some of the campaigns that go out that you can obviously see are targeted at a younger audience, and they make you cringe as much as the term millennial itself.
Right.
Whereas I was doing a trip which I think would speak really, really well to people my own age. And from the conversations that I've had with people, I know it's inspired people to get into motorcycling or ride more or take a trip or change their life in some way or buy that motorcycle that I rode. Yet motorcycle companies just aren't interested in it. So I don't think that the problem is with millennials. I think the problem is with the industry.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I don't have any numbers. Nobody has any numbers to actually support the the claim, even though it gets tossed around. But I sense a bit of passion for this subject in your answer, that your energy level went up a bit. What now that you've come back, is the reception you're getting from the motorcycle industry any different, or is it the same? And what would you say to them if given the platform to do so?
My relationship with the motorcycle industry is just as frustrating as it was when I was trying to fundraise the first time. Except people want to work with me more, but they still don't want to pay for anything. Which is, I don't know. It's a kind of brick wall conversation where you're like, I can do another trip like this, or I can do some really engaging project, which people are going to want to follow, and you'll be able to talk about it and whatever. And they're like, okay, yeah, great. That sounds amazing. And I'm like, well, it costs this much. And also it will take 6 months of my time. So I'd like to be paid for that. And they're like, okay, yeah, no, we're fine. We'll just keep putting money into MotoGP or whatever we do, with declining viewership, and everything will be fine, and we'll keep selling less and less bikes each year, and then we'll just keep blaming it on the millennials. So that's really my experience of motorcycle industry in general, and all of the money and the work that I've kind of done since coming back, and the industries and companies that have really been keen to build something together have been either alcohol companies or clothing companies from outside of motorcycling, or that have a vague kind of relationship with motorcycling. Yeah. I was fortunate enough to do some work for Barber International a few months back, and Rebel Yell Whiskey was another one that seems to support motorcycling quite a lot. So there's a lot of companies that do support the industry, but ironically they're not directly motorcycle industry companies. Yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed the same thing. And of course, this gets all the gray bearded, grumpy old man riders, kind of up in arms, and they say disparaging things about hipsters. And, nobody I know personally, fortunately, but it's, something you can see online. And I look at that and I kind of go, wait a minute, but isn't it great if the people who are the tastemakers in the world are prepared to spend their resources to tell the world that motorcycling is cool? So, when I see something that you've done with Barber or with Mallet, my reaction is, that's awesome, cool. Like everything that you're showing the world only benefits me as a rider. It's funny it seems to be an exceptional reaction. How does this play out when you speak to groups? Because I know you do that, right? You turn up at events and tell people what you've done and engage them in conversation. How does all this play out with real people?
Yeah, I think, well, there's obviously opinions on both sides, and it was something that had both huge positive and negative effects on me throughout the trip. Everyone's got an opinion, and everyone's going to shout it at you online, whether they leave a comment on a news article that someone else has written or whether they send it to you directly. There's a lot of people that have but they must be very boring lives to take time out of their day to negatively impact someone else. And yeah, the hipster thing was something that I got a lot. Like, I don't know, a stupid hipster doing it on a stupid bike, or this hipster's definitely going to die, or I can't wait until hipsters leave motorcycling alone forever. But for me, I wanted to be myself on every kind of level. And I, as we'd spoken about, started in motorcycling from a more aesthetic point of view with classic and vintage and custom motorcycles. And that's not something that completely disappeared when I decided I wanted to ride a motorcycle for a long distance. And I didn't want to compromise that. And I didn't want to completely lose my personality whilst riding these motorcycles. So for me, it wasn't like I was trying to make things really difficult for myself, or ride a certain motorcycle or wear a certain thing purely to be trendy. I did it because I wanted to every step of the way. I worked with companies that I admired, companies that I thought made really good products. And I wore clothes that I liked. I rode a bike that I thought was the right bike for the job and that I enjoyed riding and looking at. And to be honest, you get to a point where you're like, anything negative that you can think of to say to me, I really don't care, because I did it because I wanted to and I enjoyed it. And I take full responsibility for every decision that I made. And I mean, you do it how you want to do it when you get around to doing it, which will probably never happen because you're too busy sat there complaining and shouting horrible things at people.
Yeah, I really feel you on that. My only suggestion would be to consider podcasting, because it's a lot harder to say negative things to a podcaster. It's more work. So there's that. Plus, it seems like people who listen to podcasts are much more reasonable and positive folks. So that's actually a half serious suggestion. If you want to see the motorcycling world in a brighter light, ping me after this conversation and I'll tell you how to get started.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of double-edged sword of doing anything in the public eye. Really, I gained, just to put it into perspective, 70% of my trip I did staying with people through social media, meeting people through social media who would put me up, feed me. And that was the only way that I was able to keep things within budget, and also just brought so much joy, so many incredible experiences to my trip and to my life. And that was only possible because of social media. Mm. And would I switch all of that off to avoid the probably less than 50 people that tried to have a negative impact on my journey? Never, because the positives did far outweigh the negatives. But you don't have that choice. You're kind of, it's an on or off switch, really.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think that's awesome. I'm not sure. I might be a little too thin-skinned to do what you did, but I think that reaction is the right one. Now,
it's difficult. I think in some ways I'm thick-skinned, and in some ways I can say I'm thick-skinned. Stuff still really gets to you. The worst part is when it comes from people that you respect, or people in the industry that you really think should sort of know better. From random people, I really couldn't care less.
Right. Yeah. Yep. That's the right way to look at it. Now, of course, this didn't end when you got home. You mentioned earlier that you've become a bit of a content creator, and it looks to me like you're building a practice in motorcycle and adjacent industries. Was that sort of part of the plan, and where's it headed? Are you going to be the next branding guru in the motorcycle world?
Wasn't a plan at all. I mean, my plan at the start of the trip was stop doing what I'm doing, do the trip, and if nothing happens out of it, or even if I don't make it, at least I tried to do it, and at least I had whatever experience I had. I came back from the trip, and there was a couple of opportunities through Malay to go and do a little bit of traveling. And at that point, I realized, well, maybe now I've got a little bit of a reputation and a little bit of clout, and maybe just a little bit of credibility, because I think when I was approaching people at the age of 21 trying to fundraise for this trip, what kind of record have they got to go on? So I thought when I got back, maybe I could start to build this into something. And it's been really difficult, and I've had a few really amazing opportunities and a few great companies support me and want to be involved with what I'm doing. But yeah, I mean, I came back in April, managed to go on a 1,200-mile trip with the Malay guys in May and June. And then I was out in Rotterdam for a few dirt races, and then in Sweden and Norway over summer. But a lot of it was off my own back, contacting different companies and saying, hey, I want to do this. Could you loan me this? Could you loan me that? And I had a few jobs that were bringing money in, and then I would spend all of that money on trying to do more trips. So wasn't really getting anywhere financially. And then I went out and spent a month in Australia with my girlfriend over summer. Came back, took a 9-to-5 job with a motorcycle clothing retailer, doing marketing and social media and branding and digital stuff, all that nonsense. And I've trying to balance the freelance stuff alongside it. But yeah, like I say, it's incredibly difficult to get any money or support out of the motorcycle industry. So really, I've worked with tech companies, alcohol companies, and non-motorcycle clothing companies, which amazes me. I don't know. Yeah, if I had the answer, I'd be doing a lot more work with actual motorcycle companies, but they're just really finicky and they want a lot for not much.
Yeah, that's a familiar frustration.
Yeah.
You know, I'm thinking about a story that the guy that I interviewed for the very first episode of this podcast told me that he and some friends had done a long trip, and as he approached home, he was very excited about, seeing his wife again and sort of pulling into his driveway and, resuming normality. And then as the driveway came into view, he suddenly found himself pining for the road again. And I thought about this when I was listening to you talk, because I think if it were me, I'd feel a bit lost as to what to do next, because it was such a peak experience. And I'm wondering if you had any sort of post-ride letdown, and, if so, how did you manage it?
Yeah, I think it's an ongoing thing, trying to kind of manage your expectations from everyday life and readjust. But I mean, we previously spoke about the kind of ebbs and flows of the trip, and there was definitely a turning point where I decided that I'd sort of not had enough, but I was okay with being on the home stretch. I'd seen a lot. It's just a very intense experience, and I was ready to be back home for a little bit. But arriving back to the UK did just feel like another day in the trip, and that the next day would be another day in the journey, and it would carry on. And I felt like a tourist in my own town for a long time. And even now, I feel very strange about being in one place. I was lucky when I came back. I had a few other trips on the horizon and wasn't stuck in one place for too long, which was really nice for kind of breaking me back into normality. But it's harder to adjust to coming back home than it was to leaving, because it's less gradual. And when I came home, it was literally like, okay, you're not riding around the world anymore. And then unfortunately, a couple of months later, my motorcycle got stolen. So that was no bike, no travel at all.
Oh no, that's terrible. Because I'm hearing you talk, it seems like you're sort of forever changed in some ways. I mean, motorcycles are obviously a huge part of your life right now. They were big before you left, but they're huge now. And I would submit maybe a big part of your identity. You've attached yourself to this, very important cause. You've found a network of people and companies, in this world that have some interest in it as well. It seems like your life it seems like you're a different in some ways a different person now. And I wonder where, and I guess we've touched on this, but I wonder where you see yourself going from here. I don't mean tomorrow or next week or in a year, but I wonder how this has affected the trajectory of your life.
Yeah, I think it's completely changed my goals and which direction my life is heading in, especially previously working in music and basing my wants and my journey, my future plans on that, and working within that industry, to cutting all of that, doing the trip, coming back, having no plan, but this has kind of formed, and finding more and more things that I enjoy and can make a living from within motorcycles, and trying to piece that together into my ideal kind of career. And then I don't know, honestly, it changes day to day, Bruce. There's certain things which I know that I enjoy, and if I can do more of them, fantastic. But I have no set path or real goals, because I know how finicky it is, and I know that I don't want to get obsessed on any one thing, because I want the flexibility to spend more time doing what I enjoy, whether that is riding motorcycles or traveling or talking to people about motorcycles, or whether that becomes something completely different.
Mm-hmm. Have you been tempted to write about this? Is there a book in you?
No, it's always asked. Actually, everyone always asks, "So when's the book coming out?" And for me, I didn't do it to write a book. I did it to experience it, and to kind of meet people and not sound preachy, but raise awareness and just talk about motorcycling, its benefits to me, travel, mental health, all of these things. And just to experience it was my goal. There's so many amazing books already in circulation, which had really inspired me, and I hold them in such high esteem, and watch what they did in such high esteem, that to try and, if I was going to release something like a book, I would have to compete with that, with what I put on a pedestal. And it's not something that I feel that I could do. I also feel like it's been done. There are other ways, potentially better ways, to communicate with people now that maybe weren't available, wasn't an option when Ted Simon wrote Jupiter's Travels, or Elspeth Beard was putting her book together. So it's, I don't know, it's a changing landscape, and I think you have to have that goal in you from the start, and really you have to choose one goal to focus your trip around. For me, it was just doing it, just experiencing it, and then raising money and awareness for November, but also getting the world record. That was kind of my little bundle. I think if you wanted to write a book, you'd have to kind of build it from that at the outset, and that's the same for a photo book or a documentary or a film or whatever. You have to have that there with you at the start.
Yeah. Well, I think practically that's true. But it's funny. I mean, I think a book about a motorcycle trip is certainly the obvious place to go. But I hope you're getting a chance to also tell this story of someone, who's fought the fight that you have for mental health, because that's almost its own story. I mean, we kind of kicked off this conversation by saying there are these two narratives, and I think either of them could produce some inspiration for people out there, who might need it. So I hope at least you keep speaking and keep seeking fame for this, however uncomfortable that may be, because I think it's important.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just I don't know, my kind of ambition lies in traveling, talking to people, engaging with people, and doing things that can inspire other people to think I can do that as well, or if he can do that, then why can't I?
Right.
Not have this kind of barrier of this is my trip and this level that I'm on and you're all down here and you only get to watch. I want people to actually, what I am able to do, I want people to look at that and think, why am I not doing that as well?
Indeed. And I don't think there's any limit to the size of the audience for that message. So in the meantime, while your life unfolds, you're still getting some riding in over there, it seems to me, even with all the current troubles. I think you just recently modified your bike. Is riding still a daily part of your life?
Yeah, I commute to work about 60, 70 miles a day on the bike. But I mean, today it's all kind of come to a stop for who knows how long. We've been told not to leave the house unless it's essential, and advice from emergency services as well. I mean, I went out for a ride on Saturday or Sunday with a few friends, keeping social distancing in mind and not coming into direct contact with each other and standing a good distance apart when we did stop. And then came home and was speaking to a few other people, and was given a completely different perspective that by riding a motorcycle, you're potentially putting more strain on National Health Service and emergency response and people that really just don't need you to be causing problems at the moment. Ironically, one of the guys that I was riding with actually came off on Saturday morning and broke his hand. He's fine, but that put into perspective, well, maybe I shouldn't be riding, even though it's falls within the bounds of social distancing and is something that is beneficial to my mental health and my well-being. Maybe it's time just to consider all the factors and make an informed decision on that. But today we've been kind of given the advice, or not really the advice anymore. We've been given the command that we should all be working from home, staying inside. All of the shops have shut, all of the bars, restaurants, pubs, cafes, everything's shut now.
Yeah, here too. But, well, I mean, the only comfort there is for any of us is that this will end. These do end. And I think the power of your story will endure, not to be dramatic about it, but we had an exchange by email this week in which you confessed that what you'd been through on the road had, prepared you in some small ways for the unexpected turn life has taken. So, in a way, I think this episode will be well timed. Henry, this has just been wonderful. I'm so impressed with what you've done and with who you are, and I'm so happy that you could talk about it with me, especially during these strange days. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure, and I always find that just sitting, kind of settling into the day-to-day, some of the stories and some of the emotions take a back seat, and it's great for me to have the opportunity to talk to someone and sort of relive it again and just ponder on it for a little while.
I think people will appreciate it. I have the very strong impression that, to use your word, a little escape, isn't a bad thing right now. So maybe on their behalf, thanks also for sharing your story. And if fate should ever bring you to Canada, do let us know. I'll make sure all the Canadians are ready for you.
Yeah, it's very high on my list.
It's a beautiful place. Well, be careful and stay well, and we'll all look forward to getting back on the road again. And thank you.
Yeah, you too, Bruce. Have a lovely rest of your day.
And you too. As sometimes happens when I'm editing these, I realized here that I had missed the chance to ask a question. In this case, maybe the most important question of all. So I emailed Henry Crew to follow up. Did it work, I said? Did this journey, nothing in front of you and everything in front of you, did this journey give you the reset you were hoping for? His reply was insightful, and maybe even more than he realized. He wrote, "The trip definitely changed everything for me. It forced my hand in a lot of ways." And then he added, "Coming back home was more alien than leaving, I think." Which, if you happen to be a student of Joseph Campbell, is exactly the right answer. Campbell was a scholar who made a career out of writing about transformational journeys, about how we're all destined to take one, and how they're at the root of personal growth and of every story in life worth telling. He called them hero's journeys, and the final step in their process, the one we're all supposedly in search of, is what he called the freedom to live. The definition of which has a lot to do with freedom from fear. I'll spare you the whole seminar, except for this one quote. Campbell once wrote, "The hero is the champion of things becoming, not of things become." Well, if we were to ask him, I think Joseph Campbell would say that Henry Crew's journey was a success, not because of what he found, but because of what he let go of. And for me, this time-worn bit of English lit curriculum unlocked his whole story. From the chaos of departure to brushes with mortality, to finding love, to coming home a blank slate, Henry had chosen to use a motorcycle to what I think is its highest purpose. Not as a way to escape what's around us, but as a way to escape what's inside us, what's stopping us from becoming. Well, that may sound like a lot to expect from a little machine, and yet as Henry Crew's story proves yet again, somehow they never let us down. Well, thanks for listening. You'll find show notes for this episode at thismotorcyclelife.com. That's also how you can reach me if you have questions, comments, or suggestions. thismotorcyclelife@gmail.com works too, and I promise you'll hear back from me. You can also follow me on Instagram, where I like to post pictures of bikes I find on the street. Spring is finally here. And where you can find a lot of the people I've interviewed for this podcast, including Henry Crew. Out of solidarity with our friends in Europe during this difficult time, this episode's playlist recommendation comes from Spain. The band is called The Wild Horses. Their catalog is a loving tribute to classic American rock, and their musicianship is impeccable, so there was lots to choose from. But this track seemed to sum up Henry Crew's story pretty well, even if it does age me a bit. It's called I Won't Back Down. You can buy it wherever you like to get your music. And in the meantime, keep staying alive out there.
The gates of hell, but I won't back down. No, I stand my ground, won't be turned around. And I keep this world from dragging me down. Gonna stand my ground, and I won't back down. Well, I know what's right. I got